For about a decade now, it has been my dream to have a huge work table, one that was about 5 feet by 10 feet, and I always wanted a table large enough to put one full drapery panel on the top. In the past, when I've sewn draperies, I've had smaller tables with fabric hanging over the edge, and that just doesn't work out. So I wanted a big table, and I finally have it. But the good thing about this is it's actually two tables. And so anytime I want two smaller tables for smaller projects, I can just pull them apart and have a little more room. So anyway, I think this is going to work out perfectly for me. So let me show you how I made them. To build this table, I started with the legs. And I made these out of 1.5 by 1.5 inch lumber that I found at Home Depot. And I cut them, I think I cut them to about 26.5 inches. I cut 12 of them because each leg at this stage of the project was going to require 3 pieces each. And I have 4 legs, so the last time I checked, 3 times 4 is 12. Next, I assembled the legs. And again, each leg took 3 pieces that were going to be glued and nailed together. And to start, I just stacked 2 on top of each other, glued them together, and then nailed them with 2.5 inch 16 gauge nails. And once those 2 were together, then I added the 3rd piece in the same way. Wood glue followed by nails. So at this point, my legs looked like this. They had a piece missing, but those would be added later. Next, I moved on to the bottom shelf, and this was just a 1/2 inch piece of plywood cut to 48 inches square. And I just had Home Depot cut this one for me. On the back side of the plywood, I added this frame, which is glued and nailed on. You can see that it does not cover the edges of the plywood. It's just simply on the back to give extra support. The next step was to attach the legs to the shelf. First, I cut a scrap piece of 1x3 and I clamped it to the side because a 1x3 is what I was eventually going to use to cover up those raw edges of the shelf. But that would be a later step. For now, the scrap clamped to the side would do, and I simply aligned the bottom of the legs with the bottom edge of the scrap 1x3, and then I screwed in the legs. Once I had the first leg attached, I simply turned the table and moved on to the second one. Unfortunately, I could only use my tabletop to attach 3 of the legs. I had to come up with a different process for the 4th one. My first idea didn't quite work out. I figured that I would just slide the shelf with the 3 legs over onto the floor and hope that it would stand up on its own. It took a little bit to get the thing off of the work table, but I finally got it over onto the floor, and it actually did stand up on its own. I thought that that was going to work, but for some reason I had a heck of a time getting that 4th leg to line up. I did attach it, but it just was not lined up correctly. It finally dawned on me that I could just put the shelf and leg assembly over on its side, and then I could make some easy adjustments and get the 4th leg attached like that. At this point, I went ahead and measured and cut the 1x3s to use on the edges of the plywood shelf. This way all of those ugly edges would be covered up. And since I had used a scrap piece of 1x3 as a guide for attaching the legs, then I knew that these trim pieces would line up perfectly with the bottom of the legs. I just attached these with some 16 gauge nails. With those trim pieces attached, then I was ready to move on to the apron. And for this, I just used some number 2 pine in a 1x4, and I didn't use any kind of pocket holes or fancy joinery or anything like that. I simply placed the 1x4 right into the notch of each of the legs and nailed it in. I actually nailed it in first and then followed up with some screws just for some additional support. And here's the close-up view just so you can see how that's attached. Again, that 1x4 is just right inside the notch on each of the legs. After attaching the other 3 pieces, I then went back with pre-primed 1x4s and just attached them to the top of those apron pieces. These didn't really serve any structural purpose, I just thought that they looked better. I didn't like that the original apron pieces were set so far back. With all of the apron pieces attached, I then turned the table over on its edge and began to attach the casters. For this I used big 6-inch casters, and that wasn't really my first choice, but I needed 8 casters in total, and this is the only style that they had 8 of, so I went with it. As it turns out, I really love the red casters with the green tables. It was time to finish up those legs. I did this by cutting more 1.5 by 1.5 lumber. These were obviously shorter than the originals, and just slid it right inside that notch on the back side of each of the legs. I didn't glue these in place, but I did nail them in place. And these would also lend a little more support to the apron. Once those were attached, it was time for wood filling, followed by more wood filling, and even more wood filling. And that was followed by sanding, and more sanding, and even more sanding. The final step for the table base was to cut the trim to go along the bottom edge. And of course, no work table actually needs trim, but since this is going in my pretty studio, or my studio that will eventually be pretty when it's finished, I did want this to look nice. This took a lot of miter cuts, but I finally got all the pieces cut, and then I could attach them. I attached these pieces with some small 16 gauge nails. If you use bigger nails on a trim like this, it could split the trim. But on these little pieces, I actually didn't use any nails at all because they would split if you put a nail through those. So for the tiny little inside pieces, I just used wood glue. Next, I moved on to the tabletop, and because I wanted a 60-inch square top, I had to use 3 pieces of MDF to make a tabletop that big. I started by making a frame around the edges, which I attached with wood glue and screws, and then I used scrap pieces of MDF kind of as mending plates to join the pieces where they met. I also put some additional pieces around the outside edge where the tabletop would sit on top of the table base. This would give me something to screw some brackets into that would be attached to the base and the tabletop. Next came the hardest part of this entire project, which was to get this tabletop over onto the base. And 3/4 inch MDF is not light, and this tabletop is 60 inches square, and I just happen to be 60 inches tall. So it took a bit of wrestling, but I finally got it over there, I got it centered, and I got the brackets on to hold it to the base. After filling the little cracks with wood filler and sanding the tabletop smooth, I was ready to attach the laminate. I started by rolling on some contact cement, and I found that MDF requires 2 coats of contact cement in order to make it sticky enough. But the laminate only requires 1 coat. While the adhesive on the laminate was still drying, I put some dowel rods down on the MDF tabletop. And just a note, the square ones work a lot better than the round ones. And next up was the only part of this project that I actually needed help with, and that was to get this big piece of laminate moved over onto the tabletop and centered so that I had enough hanging over on the edges. And then we started in the middle by removing the dowel rods and pressing the laminate onto the MDF, making sure that there were no bubbles. I don't really know how you would get bubbles under laminate because it's pretty thick, but I suppose that might be possible. Anyway, we started at the middle and then worked our way to the outside. And then once that was done, we did the other side. Oh yeah, and this is my mom, by the way. She was gracious enough to come and help me with this part of the project. I used my little router with a laminate bit on it to clean up the edges of the laminate and make it flush with the edge of the MDF. And by the way, this is a very messy process. The standard process here would be to cover the edges of the table with laminate as well. But I didn't have enough laminate and I did not want to buy more for the edges. So instead I opted to use 1x3 pre-primed lumber to cover up the edges. It's definitely not standard, but you know what? I think it looks pretty good. In fact, I really like it. I like that it gives the edges of the table a more substantial look, and it's wood, so it's going to be durable. With those pieces attached, the table build was done. All it needed was a little more wood filler, some caulk, a couple of coats of paint, and it was finished. Y'all, I am so excited about this huge work table, and I'm going to be putting it to use soon because I'm going to make some pink draperies for my living room. I'll bring y'all along on that project as well, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and click the little bell next to it so you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. And of course, you can always find me and my latest projects over on addictedtodecorating.com. See you next time.